I'm just going to say a few words about agency theory and bank relationship management. First of all, just a few words about the background to agency theory. It was developed in the 1970s and it came as something of a relief to those who felt that the study of organizations was very unrealistic. And the reason for this was that the assumption of organization studies was that the people in the organization were working entirely for the benefit of the company as a whole. And of course, we know that that was absolutely not the case, and that there was all sorts of what we might call politicking going on in organizations that was simply being left out, assumed away. So that made the analysis very unrealistic. Then along came agency theory, and this provided a whole new perspective because the basis of agency theory was to say that if we instead of looking at the whole organization, let's just look at the smallest element, like looking at an atom instead of looking at the whole thing. So what's the atomic element of an organization? Well, that agency theory suggested was the relationship between the manager and the managed, and that we could see an organization as a kind of network of managers and managed, and everyone was being managed by somebody above them and in turn was managing somebody below them, and that went all the way up to the shareholders and all the way down to the cleaners, if you like. So that was the simple model, this idea of managers and managed. And looking at that relationship, they were able to say that each party was out to maximize its utility or maximize its feeling of well-being, if you like. And that meant that the goals of those being managed were not necessarily the same as the managers. So it swept away this assumption that everyone was working for the interests of the company as a whole. And that was an enormous relief, if nothing else. However, it got off to a bit of a shaky start because what happened was that the mathematicians got hold of it and started talking about utility functions of the principal and the agent, and produced some very complicated mathematics to try and find insight into this relationship. Well, it took about 10 years before people began to realize that the complexity of the maths was far greater than the interest in the conclusions. And so this approach gradually faded away, though it still persists in some journals. In its place came the use of agency theory as a structure around which we can hang our various elements and also include those things that were being missed out before, the fact that those managed didn't have the same goals as the managers. Well, rather than have all this terminology about managers and managed, it's simpler and clearer to talk about the manager as a principal and the managed as an agent. And so we have this principal-agent relationship. Okay, so nowadays we use management theory to give structure to a discussion about a relationship. And there are common themes that come up in this analysis. And so these studies can help enrich our understanding. This is really just putting that relationship into a simple diagram. We have the principal and the agent. We have the principal setting targets and telling the agent what they're to do, and also importantly setting the remuneration. And the agent in return is reporting their performance to the principal, and that is going to in turn come down, be relevant for target setting and remuneration in particular. Now, one of the issues that preoccupied agency theory was the idea of the consumption of perquisites. In other words, the agent got to a certain level of performance, meeting the targets, getting their remuneration, and was able to perform above that target, but found that really the benefits of consumption of perks or perquisites was more attractive than continuing to overperform. And so what did this mean in practice? Well, it meant that the manager took the afternoon off. It meant that they, instead of saving money, they spent money on expensive meetings, on first-class travel, and so on. So they preferred to improve their lifestyle rather than improve the company's profits. And that gave rise to a huge literature on remuneration and bonus schemes to try to reduce the consumption of perquisites. And in a way, you can say that the bonus culture which we live in today was had its roots, originated, was born in agency theory, and it exists today as directors are paid millions of pounds, dependent on the performance of the share in the stock market and that sort of thing. So that's the direction that the literature went. So what we want to do is to now take this and apply it to our bank management. But before we do, we'll just add in a couple of other elements that are a little bit more relevant to our study of the relationship management. And these are, as you might expect, something to do with the information being given to the principal. So if we look at information asymmetry, this is the simple statement that the agent has a lot of information, much more than the information than he or she is going to report to the principal. So inevitably, there is information asymmetry, a mismatch in terms of quantity between the information that the agent has and the amount of information that they report upwards. They can't possibly report everything, and it's not even clear exactly how much is relevant. So this is a state of affairs between the two. And this gives rise to moral hazard, as you might expect. It is in the interests of the agent to report information that reflects their performance favorably. So this distortion of information, deliberate or otherwise, is, the principal sets the information that they require, and the agent may well see that there's other information that they ought to know about, but they're not being asked to report it. so they can perhaps leave it out, that sort of thing. That combined with outright distortion of information by, say, adding things together to make the picture look rosier, that sort of thing. So there are various ways in which the information gets slightly distorted by the difference between the goals of the agent and the goals of the principal. So these are useful terms in looking at the relationship between the two. Now let's apply the model to banking relationships. So our principal is now the bank and the agent is the customer. And the obvious difference from what I've been saying is that obviously the customer is not employed by the bank. But really, the customer is part of a network, has communication with the bank, and it is agent related in the sense that the customer is providing information to the bank and the bank is coming down with a borrowing decision. So there is this information and decision related relationship between the two. And that enables us to apply our agency model. So we have this picture of the customer going into the bank and asking for a loan and becoming part of the financial network in doing that. So we have these ideas of moral hazard and information asymmetry. The bank inevitably asks for information and the customer is kind of motivated to present a particular picture of what they want that is favorable. So even more so than within an organization, there is a strong element of moral hazard. The customer is not necessarily going to provide the bad aspects or the riskier aspects of their relationship, of the loan request. So the bank knows that the information it's getting is going to be rather distorted. Now, these are the two agency theory issues. The ones in black here are the bank issues that are relevant to our relationship management. So let's just have a quick look at those. So what's the bank's worries? Well, one is adverse selection. The customer is applying for a loan and has chosen this bank for a reason. Now that reason might be we're giving very low interest rates. It might be something like we'll give you a decision in 5 minutes, something like that. So the bank must be wary that if the customer is applying for one of its products, that they have attracted people to buy this product, but all they've got are all the dead legs who don't want too much research into their background. So the idea of giving a judgment in 5 minutes is very attractive to them. So the bank may unintentionally give attractors, advertise, and get people who are actually bad loans because they can't get loans from elsewhere. So that's one of the worries of the bank in developing the relationship with the customer. Another one is bait and switch. The customer asks for a loan and has a loan, repays it, and then asks for another loan, gets the loan, repays it, all modest loans, but increasing slightly, then asks for a big loan, gets the big loan, that's the bait, it's been baiting the company, the bank rather, and then when it gets its big loan, it disappears. And it's difficult certainly in the UK legal system to recover a bad debt. You're not going to get the full amount, and the cost of collecting it is also going to greatly reduce the attraction. And then finally, we have the problem of debt impairment, which is critical to any lending decision. If there was no debt impairment refers to bad debts, non-payment, that sort of thing. So if there was no problem of debt impairment, everybody repaid their loans, the bank manager would be standing at the doorway handing out loans to people. So really the big problem with lending is debt impairment, the problem of bad debt, and that critically affects the borrowing decision. Are they going to repay? That is the critical element. So those are the concerns of the bank. And in the agency context, they have the distortion that they would kind of expect from the applicant, and they have to try to overcome that. I've put at the top the fact that they have information about the customer that comes from other sources. So, they refer to it as data analytics or big data, where they have the credit score of the customer and other factors which I'll mention in a moment. So that is our model, and the task really is to take the notes on bank relationship management and kind of hang them onto this tree, if you like, to give your analysis of the bank relationship management, to give it structure so that it has shape rather than just list after list, which is the danger of this relationship. So try to relate the bank relationship management to the agency model. And I'll add to this a final complication, and that is that in these two readings, well, no, in the top reading, you have the issue of all the other services that the bank provides. And this may be investment advice, it may be something to do with derivative trading, it may be export and import, letters of credit, that sort of thing. So all these other factors produce income for the bank. And the relationship is not just about lending, the lending decision. And there is a crossover between the two, according to this particular paper by Santikian. So there's a crossover between the two, and in some respects, without wanting to make it too complicated, the customer then becomes the agent and employs the bank to carry out various activities to help and advise with its finance and pays them a fee and so on. So this affects the borrowing decision, and the relationship is not a simple one between the two. And the second reading there is to say that in having a better relationship, that increases the other data that the bank has on the customer. The customer is a good saver, has regular transactions, is not involved in kind of money laundering activities and things like that, because well, one of the money laundering methods is to make a request for borrowing, to give a deposit, borrow the money. The deposit is dirty money. They borrow the money and then they default. So the bank has as collateral the dirty money. So that is less likely if they have a long-term relationship with the customer. downside of that is that the bank tends to offer a lower interest rate on its loans to the customer as a favor, and that is part payment for the reduction in the risk of debt impairment. So it then becomes quite complicated. But it can start off with this simple agency model relationship and as your foundation. So do take this model and apply it to your notes, to the lists on bank relationship management.